Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omer. Now, 2018 has been a year that has seen international relations fray, binding treaties discarded, international laws for human rights violated time and again, and the United Nations face even bigger challenges than before. The ideal of a global community has failed to right the wrongs the underprivileged have faced. For each American soldier killed in conflict zones, 6 Afghan, Pakistani and Iraqi personnel have died. Every one of these deaths ruins a family and debilitates a community by and large. Indirect deaths are by majority unaccounted for. These deaths are from hunger, disease, injury and environmental degradation. But a conservative estimate by researchers have put the number to 870,000. Export licenses for military items to countries on UK's watch list have doubled since 2016. In fact, recent reports have said that arms suppliers in 2018 alone have gone up so much that buyers are spoiled for choice. Where is the world headed? What is 2019 going to look like from a humanitarian aid and a conflict crisis that's escalating point of view? We would like to welcome our guest here. Mr. Samson Salamt is a human rights activist. He'll be speaking to us from Lahore. Mr. Salamt, thank you for joining us here in Newswire. Let me ask you this, that it's been 70 years since the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. How do you see the world is doing in upholding these commitments that are enshrined in this very important document?
Thank you, Ayza. First of all, I would like to congratulate all those who are able to bring this Universal Declaration on Human Rights and all those who have struggled throughout 70 years for the implementation of this very, very important document. I think one of the positive things is that because of this document, today we are talking about human rights and there is a lot of awareness on human rights and fundamental freedoms. And that is because of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. But on the other side, if we look at the implementation on what standards and values which has been mentioned in UDHR, I think we are lacking behind so much. If we look at today's world, we see that there is state repression, oppression all around the world, and hunger is increasing. There is less focus on freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and other fundamental freedoms. But especially there is less focus on providing children their right to education, health, and other basic human rights.
And Mr. Salamt, if you could expand a little on why do you see that the importance given to the rehabilitation, especially of children, of civilians in war-torn regions, has gone down in these years?
Well, first of all, we need to understand that why wars and conflicts are dangerous, especially for children and other vulnerable people. And if we look at the facts and figures that claim that wherever there is a war or conflict, the children are the more affected. And I'm not a pessimistic person, but the situation actually compels us to believe that the trends that we see in our world, that the conflicts and wars are in tendency, and we see a lot of conflict growing around the world. There is a fear that there are new challenges emerging, especially for the vulnerable people, and I would say especially for the children. For instance, humanitarian emergencies and extreme poverty are driving waves of displacement, and also this climate change and environmental degradation are increasing the spread of diseases like malaria and humanitarian other issues. For instance, if we look at Yemen crisis, which is currently a matter of grave concern for the whole world, but especially for the people who are engaged in human rights work. Millions of children are deprived of humanitarian aid, and their life is under threat. And this is what our world need to focus on right now.
And this time round, 2018 saw UNICEF appeal for the largest amount of aid ever in its history. But what we're seeing is that there seem to be a lot of roadblocks in getting the aid to the people who deserve it the most. Can you talk a little about what kind of political and other issues stop the aid from getting there effectively?
Well, one of the drawback in our world today is that the states, their priority is not the humanitarian aid or providing people the humanitarian aid, but there is more investment on wars and weapons and non-production budgets. So that's what the focus is, which is very unfortunate. And I think that is one of the reasons that our world leaders need to address, that we need to invest more on humanitarian and such aid which might provide assistance to the people in poor countries and bring up the people who are vulnerable, who are in poverty, extreme poverty, and are not getting, the children are not getting education and health facilities. I think there are a lot of political reasons, and the state seems not serious in providing humanitarian aid.
One of the difficulties that humanitarian aid appeals have faced, agencies have faced in collecting humanitarian aid is that the numbers, there's been a slowdown observed in the amount of money coming in to help conflict zones. Why do you think there is such a decrease this year in humanitarian aid coming in?
Well, I think, again, I would say there are political reasons. In some conflict areas, the world has more focus, and in other countries may not be. I think world, especially at the United Nations Forum, need to see all conflicts at an equal stage. I mean, the crisis in Yemen or crisis in Afghanistan or any other crisis should be seen as equal crisis, and it should not remain only organizing the conference and talking about the conflicts. But I think it's important that the world powers, the states, they really focus on providing assistance to every crisis to bring people out of that crisis.
Okay, and now I would like to welcome second guest, Mr. Mustafa Khoshcheshm, who is joining us from Tehran. He's a political analyst. Welcome to the show, Mr. Mustafa. We are taking a look at 2018 from the light of how humanitarian aid has not reached effectively the people in conflict zones. What is your take on it? And do you feel that the difficulties in reaching the people who need it most have been highlighted enough this year?
Hello, and thanks for having me on the show. Well, as a matter of fact, I believe there is a very principal and basic problem here, that as far as the United Nations is not the final decision maker that could enforce its decisions, as the body that represents the world community. And there are rogue states that have power, and they wield their power, impose their will on other nations. The UN and its affiliated bodies, including those humanitarian agencies, may not make much advance and progress in various areas of health, education, and feeding the poor. Just take a look at the conditions prevailing throughout the Middle East as well as South America. We could see caravans of thousands of people are leaving their homes and countries in the hope of finding a better socioeconomic conditions, and they are treated, of course, in the worst possible way. Just take a look at the Middle East, where Yemen is the poorest Arab nation. Over 1 million people, actually mostly children, are on the brink of starvation. The nation has been ravaged by various battles and war, especially by the Saudi-led coalition. Cholera is spreading across the nation, and more people are on the brink of starvation, including 8 million adults and children who would soon starve to death in coming months if UN agencies and other world bodies are not allowed to, go and rush to their aid. UN agencies and independent international organizations like Doctors Without Borders, they have stopped operating in conflict zones like Yemen because that nations like the United States, as well as its regional allies, they are not abiding by international rules. There have been multiple reports by various UN agencies like UNICEF, like Amnesty International, like many others that have been critical of the Saudi-led coalition, requesting them to stop bombing the nation, but they've remained adamant because it's the rule of jungle. As a matter of fact, when you have the power, you may advance your objectives no matter how illegal they are. And as far as the world may not work out a formula or a body to force such states to stop their destructive measures, there would not be much hope that could be pinned on the work of agencies that rush to their aid, to the aid of these war-ravaged and starving nations. The same is true with regard to Syria, where the U.S. has been bombing many, civilians, especially in the northwest, according to documentation, even acknowledgments made by the U.S. Army. And without the UN mandate and without being requested by the Syrian government, they've been there and bombing civilians on the pretext of war against terrorism. Another, major point is that such aid to the communities and nations in need cannot be, extended before security and stability are restored to this conflict zone. So it's a prerequisite to establish relevant security and stability before aid could be, rushed to these areas. Another unfortunate fact is the major role that extremism and terrorism contribute to damaging security and stability of this planet. And unfortunately, world nations do not have a common understanding of even the definition for terrorism, let alone launching a shared and common campaign against terrorism and extremism. As long as the world cannot work out shared understanding of each other's, goals and agendas, and as long as the world cannot work out a formula to stop the rogue states and those nations that, according to Donald Trump, they work for the sake of their own interests, meaning that they prioritize their national interests over other human beings across the planet, not much hope can be pinned on the future.
Mr. Salamat, what Mr. Mustafa has said, I think it's key in what his statement started as, that the UN, as long as it has veto power, certain countries get to push their agenda with just one vote. This will continue to interfere in the peace process in these regions. Do you see it this way as a human rights activist trying to reach out to communities that need help in these conflict zones? How big a hurdle is this posing?
I think veto power has been a very controversial issue at the United Nations system. And there has been efforts within the system to bring reforms in the United Nations because this system gives power to specific states, and they can politically maneuver the system and do whatever they want sometimes. I think I totally agree with the points made by my friend from Iran, and we need to move towards that.
And Mr. Mustafa, we're talking about accountability here. April this year, the US-led NATO coalition backed Afghan Air Force. It killed 36 students, teachers and parents at a graduation ceremony. And just like that, without any kind of follow-up, what has been done to avoid civilian casualties, and where is the international community in its quest for accountability?
As a matter of fact, there is no accountability at all. When a country like the United States, that's a major power, it gets into wherever it wants and it starts war on any nation on the pretext of extremism and terrorism ever since 2001 at least, that started with Afghanistan. We may not see any kind of accountability. As I just mentioned, the same thing has happened in Iraq and in Syria, where the U.S. has been bombing schools and hospitals and the civilian population in completely civilian neighborhoods. And they are not accounting for their deeds anywhere. In Afghanistan, they started everything from there, from Afghanistan, but we have not seen a clamping down on terrorism all throughout the last 17 or 18 years in the longest ever war history has witnessed, actually, in the last 100 years. The United States has failed to even present a main achievement of its deployment in Afghanistan. As a matter of fact, they are now using Afghan soil in order to turn the region into a hotbed of tensions. There have been official reports by Russia and Iranian government all complaining that the United States has been transferring some top commanders of ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant terrorist group, to Afghanistan. And there are good reasons for that geopolitically. From a strategic viewpoint, if Afghanistan could, turn into a hotbed of new waves of terrorism to damage, Chinese economy in areas that are near China, also pose threats, direct threats to Iran through cross-border attacks that are very common on Iran's eastern borders, and also pose threat to Russia. So it seems that the United States is pursuing a completely different agenda when it comes to terrorism. And despite the fact that they've been warned against such instrumental use of terrorism, they continue, using proxy forces because they are not the ones that, feel and experience the repercussions first. When they started, according to former U.S. Vice President Joe Biden, who blamed Saudi Arabia as well as Turkey and Qatar for the war of militancy in the Middle East 2 years ago. He said that in an address to an academic center. When they started this proxy warfare, the first waves of displaced people and immigrants, they left their country, Syria, as well as Iraq, for countries of the region like Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, and then moved on to Europe. So the socioeconomic burden has been felt by these nations and not the United States. The United States has remained immune to much of the repercussions of its, strategies, through using proxy forces to weaken its foes and enemies. The same kind of condition has been seen in Afghanistan. And as far as the world cannot, as I mentioned earlier, work out some very robust and powerful, body and formula to force the United States and any other country to account for their deeds, I believe there won't be any impediment to the United States to continue the same kind of strategy.
Mr. Mustafa, I want to talk a little about Iran's role in humanitarian crisis and aid. But Mr. Salamt, quickly, last question from you. What has Pakistan's role been in rehabilitation? Pakistan has been the recipient of one of the largest number of Afghan refugees in the past 3 decades alone. And what kind of roadblocks do we face in trying to cater to this huge number of people who leave behind their homes, their lives, and to try and merge them into this society?
Well, I think I would say that this is one of the impacts of the crisis, and this is what the world needs to understand, that whenever there is a conflict, there is a displacement, and that create crisis. And I think Pakistan has hosted the Afghan refugees for a long time. And the best solution, and Pakistan has been saying this for a long time, that they want the Afghan refugees go back to their country and settle their life in their own country. And I think that is the best policy.
So much, Mr. Salamt. Here, I would like to welcome our third guest, Mr. Abdul Sami Khan, is an education policy specialist. He's joining us here from Islamabad. Welcome to the show, Mr. Abdul Sami. Let me ask you this: that you're an expert on education, and generally across the world, researchers continue to push education as enabling right, as the most effective means of reducing poverty, for generating economic growth in societies, and generally creating peace in the region. Do you see that this is losing importance in the international theater of war and rehabilitation?
In general, there has been a shift in the international thinking on education, and here we're talking about mostly the developing countries. What started in 1990 and then later on in 2000 with the Education for All and the Millennium Development Goals. A lot of emphasis at that time was in terms of getting children into school. Mm-hmm. But I think over the last 10, 15 years, there have been two experiences that the world has had. Number one, just getting children into school is not enough. You need children who are not only in school, who are learning. And they're learning in terms of reading, in terms of critical analytical ability. And there's also now a greater emphasis on global citizenship and understanding of what basically peace, education, and global citizenship is going to be about. And that's very much a very strong component of the new SDGs that we have. So there has been a shift in the thinking. As to actually what is happening on ground, it would vary from place to place and depends on how functional the education system of a specific country is.
So let me be more specific. We know that in conflict zones, education obviously is the last thing on anyone's mind. It is mostly to try and save those civilians from bullets and from injuries. But if we were to do a comparison in 2018 on the numbers of how education fared in developed nations and even underdeveloped nations, do we see an improvement generally, or do you feel like that there's been a policy shift?
I think there's been a shift. I think there's been a shift in terms of the thinking itself. I mean, if you see 2018 and you go back about 20 years, about 1/3 of sub-Saharan African countries were in conflict. Today, there's hardly any country. And there's been a lot of reconstruction, and there's been a lot of reconstruction of education thought process in those countries. Now, there are other countries where new conflicts have come up. And I think there, because some of those parts, for example, the Middle East, those were not areas which 20 years ago were the world's concern as far as conflict was concerned, not the way the conflict has arisen there now. So I think there the realization is coming a little later. And those education systems, as these countries hopefully are going to come out of these conflicts, they will probably have to reconstruct their education systems a bit differently now.
Okay. I want to come back to you, Mr. Mustafa. We were talking about humanitarian aid reaching conflict zones, especially children, and especially you were highlighting how these proxy wars and the blame game continues to burden down on Iran itself. Could you talk a little about the situation on the ground in Iran and how they reach out to these areas where rehabilitation is needed most?
Well, as regards Syria, Iran has been doing its best in order to help the displaced people as well as refugees within the borders of Iraq and Syria, as well as other communities that have taken refuge in neighboring countries. But with regard to Yemen, despite frequent efforts by Iran to send humanitarian aid, especially food and medicine. The Saudi-led coalition that has imposed a very tight siege on the Yemeni nation, they have not allowed any of Iranian parcels and cargoes to go through, the siege. So the Yemenis, it's no secret that the Yemenis are in the worst type of conditions, and they've been there for several months like this. But Iran, is a state that has been a host to one of the largest population of refugees in the last several decades. After war intensified and escalated in Afghanistan, even before 2001, when the Taliban, surged and they rose and toppled the government in Kabul, millions of Afghan refugees have taken shelter in Iran, and they have somehow intermingled with the native community. The same is true, of course, of smaller size with regard to the Iraqis under Saddam Hussein. In the early years after Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1978, Saddam Hussein started a very harsh clampdown on Iraqi Shiites. So hundreds of thousands of Shiite Iraqis took refuge in Iran, and millions of Afghans and Iraqis that emigrated or took shelter in Iran are still in the country, though some hundreds of thousands have repatriated to their own country. Yet, the United Nations has an agreement with many nations, including Iran, to rush to their aids in return for annual subscription fees or contributions that they make in order to help nations that are the destination of such large numbers of foreign refugees, despite the fact that Iran has been a member of such treaties, and it has had the agreement, always been in there. The United Nations has not extended much aid, especially financial aid, to Iran as a host country, especially because of Iran's, the anti-Iran sanctions imposed by the United States and the banking problems, the financial problems that the United States has caused for Iran. And second reason is the influence that the United States has in order to deter such UN aid to Iran all throughout the last several decades. The same has been happening with regard to anti-drug agencies of the UN, which have been requested and duty-bound, actually, to help Iran. The Western states, led by the United States, they do not allow them, supply Iran with the sophisticated technology like night vision goggles and other equipment and devices that Iran needs in order to stand against drug traffickers and international drug cartels. So, and on this way, you may see that Iran is not receiving much aid in its battle against drug or in hosting millions of foreign refugees, but still it's doing its best. Like a few years ago, the Iranian leader ordered the government and all institutions to provide free of charge schooling for Afghan refugees and allow them to educate in the nation, even if they do not have any IDs. And there have been also growing merits provided in the last few years for the Afghan refugees who have not naturalized in Iran but are still staying in Iran. And we need to remember that millions of refugees, they cause socioeconomic problems for any hosting nations. We do remember that Germany allowed 1 million foreign refugees, mainly Syrians, and now Merkel, the chancellor, who was really in power and the most powerful European leader, has now lost power and has declared that she would soon retire from the post. This is the impact of, this game. A wave of refugees that come to destination to countries that host them. So Iran has been grappling with so many problems in areas of health, education, and so on and so forth, especially welfare, because of hosting such millions of refugees. But still, it is hosting them.
Now, last question to you, Mr. Mustafa. We were talking about children being the recipient of the most violence, and here in an incident that took place that really shook the world for the time being. In August earlier this year, a bomb was dropped on a school bus. It killed 40 boys between the ages of 6 and 11, and the bomb was traced back to the US manufacturer. Again, the question of accountability, and especially in light of children being the largest number dead in these conflicts. Where is the accountability? Do you feel like the community in large has completely gone silent on such a massive incident?
Of course, despite the fact that we see some news reports coming out on the world media outlets about such crimes that you just mentioned, we do need to remember that the world politics is dirty and it's playing dirty. The Saudi-led coalition that I spoke about for a few minutes, in response to your first couple of questions, it is sitting as the chair of the executive committee of the UN Human Rights Commission. And this is no joke, because such a state that sits in there and is among the chair of that executive committee it's tasked with studying various cases of complaint that are sent to that committee in order to decide which one should go under further investigation and which one should not. So as a matter of fact, in practice, you see that the Yemenis, poor Yemenis, they are bombed. They send a complaint to the UN Human Rights Commission, and then they refer the same case to Saudi Arabia, irrespective of the fact that it is one of the parties involved in this war, and the complaint is against Saudi Arabia. So, and we do remember 3 years ago when Saudi Arabia's name was mentioned by the UN as to be among those states that are called child rights abusers, the Saudis and a number of their,
I'm sorry, Mr. Mustafa, I'll cut you here. We've just run out of time. Thank you for joining us here on Newswire, and you too, Mr. Abdul Sami, for giving us your time. We'll be taking a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newswire. I'd like to welcome my guest from Istanbul. He's a journalist, Mr. Mehboob Jeelani. Welcome to the show. The children living in conflict zones, according to several reports, have gone up by 74% in the last decade. Do you see that the humanitarian efforts put up by the world, by the community in large, are keeping up with this rise?
The world leaders are not doing enough, to be honest. Like, we are not addressing the root causes of this large-scale hunger, disease, and displacement. We have come to the point where climate change, wars, and conflicts is causing a refugee crisis of like massive proportions. So on top of that, there is ethnic cleansing, and there is a political persecution which is pushing a lot of people out of their homes. But when it comes to the world leaders, how they are trying to tackle this, I guess there's a lot to be done on that front. Like United Nations recently came up with a report which was compiled by its scientific panel on climate change, because climate change is another major problem that is becoming that is leading to a mass and massive like scale of migration and refugee crisis in the country, in the world. So basically, the scientific report clearly mentions that in order to tackle the large-scale displacement, the world economy needs to be transformed at a speed and scale that has no documented historic precedent. All right. So to deal with that, the carbon footprint has to come down. the countries, the leading economies that are leaving behind the carbon footprint are massive because of the fact that they want to reach like massive proportions of industrial goals. So we need at least $27,000 per ton of carbon dioxide in the next 5 or 6 decades in order to deal with the rising carbon dioxide emissions. And that's impossible because at this stage, what we are seeing is Donald Trump in America denying climate change and many other world leaders refusing, especially China and the developing countries, refusing to bring down their carbon footprint. So we're going to have more climate change refugees in the coming days. And the problem becomes a bit more complex when war and conflict, it adds to it. There are about 25.4 million refugees that are basically war and conflict refugees. That are war and conflict related. So basically,
So, a report from the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, they've issued this report recently that found that the number of attacks on educational institutions have gone up. They've actually put a number to it. 12,700 took place between 2013 and 2017 alone. Now, the laws for the protection of children and civilians in conflict zones seem to be largely ignored. Is that the case, or do you feel like that those voices are just not heard in the international community?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, there are about 150 million children that are under 5 who basically are, they have no whatsoever. There's no avenue of their upward mobility. There are lots of children who are, especially if you look at the Syrian refugees who are spread around Turkey and in some parts of Europe and in the Middle East. It's just, I think, the Turkey is the only country, I guess, that has a very steady and well thought out policy with regards to educating these children and sending them to schools. Then there are lots of refugees who are basically have left Myanmar because of the ethnic cleansing and they're living in Bangladesh. They are not going to schools at all. I mean, there are no refugee camps where that are supported by big aid organizations or that are fully supported by states wherein early age education and infrastructure for education has been put in place. I agree. That's a big crisis. That's something the world has to kind of focus on in the coming years.
And Turkey itself has hosted thousands of refugees in the past 3-4 years. As the Syrian conflict goes on, what are the hardest issues or the problems that it's faced in rehabilitating or providing assistance to these refugees?
Well, I think the middle income and developing countries like Uganda, Pakistan, and Turkey are taking the world's largest number of refugees, if you look at the number-wise. And speaking of Turkey, I think Turkey's 3.5 million Syrian refugees at this stage. A lot of them are living in camps. A lot of them are living in Turkish cities, different Turkish cities. Many of them, who are in the camps are entitled to some benefits like, some money that can help them buy some little amount of food. And there are also some training programs that are held in the camps trying to build skills, make sure that these refugees have enough skills in order for them to go out in the market and basically get a job or something. And that also has helped some southeastern Turkish cities that are hosting the large number of refugees. It has helped them, reignite their economic activities. So it's proving beneficial for Turkey in southeastern parts as well, even though Turkey is putting a lot of money from the state exchequer in order to look after these refugees. But the problem is that, eventually the world has to think about how they can make sure all these refugees go back home or get successfully integrated in different societies they are living. But the way Europe is shutting the doors, if you look at Italy, Matteo Salvini's recent decree, which is anti-migrant decree, it kind of takes all the humanitarian protection away from refugees. So basically, if somebody shows up in Italy, they will be deported within 180 days.
Okay, let me invite other guests here. Justice retired Ali Nawaz. He's also the chairman of the National Commission of Human Rights here in Islamabad. Welcome to the show. Could you talk a little more about the issues facing the refugees assimilating in these countries, especially keeping in light that 2018 saw, though many peace talks began and some of them are still underway, but the conflict zones continue to see fatalities go up?
Too little is being done, and there has to be a resolve to solve these problems. Take case of Syria, take the case of other conflict zones, even Afghanistan, where because of which we have such a large number of refugees camped in Pakistan. And because of those refugees, our own civilization is disturbed, our own values are disturbed, and our cultural aspects are also are disturbed. And besides, the employment which should go to Pakistanis has been taken over by people from Afghanistan. But then we have the other world conflict zones, whether created by people like Boko Haram, who are plundering part of Nigeria. And then we have what is happening in next to Turkey, and people are just in refugee camps in Turkey in such a large number, in Jordan because of Syria. Of course, people who travel to Europe and are in Germany, they are comfortable because these are settled countries.
But Justice Nawaz, let me ask you this. While the crisis goes on, the number of those displaced, number of refugees increases, the main problem doesn't seem to be addressed at all. There are arms sales that we have seen increase. Just UK alone, though has 30 countries on its watch list, has doubled its sales to them, despite publicly expressing condemnation to these countries. If arms sales are not going to stop, the people who did stop were Germany, Finland and Denmark, but their contribution to overall arms sales is minute as compared to US and UK. Why isn't the world talking about these issues? Why is there no international pressure on these countries?
I think the arms industry in USA is said to be one of the major catalysts in this regard. And they sell their arms and they make the foreign policy of the USA. It's not me saying it, it's what Eisenhower has also said, that as long as we have the arms industry here, well, there will be no peace elsewhere. So this is happening at other places as well, and nobody is finding out what is the trail of the arms which come to these conflict zones. What to talk of little being done, I think more is being done to put fuel on the fire. So the conflict keeps on increasing. Of course, I have great, objections on the Muslim world as well. With 55 countries, we are unable to cater for the essentials. That is, have a mechanism to resolve the problems, and also to see that we provide essentials for those who are displaced. Nothing has been done in Syria, nothing has been done in Iraq, nothing has been done in Kashmir. OIC is sleeping. So are the other Muslim countries. Now, behind the back, we see good contacts taking place between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But to see what has happened in Gaza, see what is happening over there, the Israelis are with impunity killing people, these people who are innocent, and they only have stones, nothing else. So this will go on because of the vested interest, and because some of the countries do not want things to settle. But can't we, as Muslim countries, 55 in numbers, as I may say again, create a mechanism to solve our problems at least? Imagine the killings in Kashmir. I haven't heard any resolution coming from the Muslim countries. They are all quiet. If Saudis wanted,
I'm
could
so
have
sorry
done
to
it.
cut you here, Justice Richard Nawaz. We have just out of time. I'd like to thank you for your contribution here to Newswire, and Mr. Mehboob Jeelani from Istanbul, all the way coming from Istanbul. Thank you so much for joining us. It is a very important year, definitely, and it comes to a close with casualties rising day by day, hundreds of innocent civilians killed in the name of war, in the name of democracy, or in the name of some unsaid proxy war going on with regional superpowers. The cost of war continues to overshadow the cost of human life. And it is time that regional powers realign themselves for bringing peace to this world that the children hold their future in, and not for pocketing millions from the arms industry. That's all from Newswire. See you next week.